Sometimes the hardest choice isn't between right and wrong. It's between family and conscience. In the rugged canyons of the Old West, a young woman faces that very choice. She's the daughter of an outlaw leader, forced to ride with 200 killers hunting for stolen gold. But when she meets a lone mountain man who stands against her father's gang, everything changes. She doesn't beg him for mercy. She asks for his trust. With a whispered warning, "They're coming at dawn," she betrays her own blood to save an innocent man. Now surrounded by an army of outlaws, they make their stand together. Not out of vengeance, but out of hope. Can two unlikely souls survive when the sun rises and the shooting starts? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jonas Brennan woke before dawn, as he had every morning for the past 15 years. The cabin was cold, the fire reduced to embers that glowed faintly in the darkness. He lay still for a moment, listening to the familiar sounds of Red Bluff Canyon, the whisper of wind through pine, the distant call of an owl, the creak of timber settling in the chill. These sounds were his companions now, reliable and unchanging. He rose slowly, his 58-year-old body protesting the movement with aches that had become routine. The wooden floor was smooth beneath his bare feet, worn down by thousands of such mornings. He moved to the fireplace and added kindling, coaxing the embers back to life with practiced patience. As the flames grew, their light revealed the cabin's simple interior, a single room with a sleeping alcove. A sturdy table, 2 chairs, shelves lined with books, and hooks on the wall where his rifle and coat hung waiting. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a silver pocket watch. Jonas didn't touch it this morning, though his eyes lingered on it as they did every day. The watch had belonged to his wife Sarah. It was one of the few things he had left of her, along with memories that grew softer with each passing year. Like photographs fading in sunlight, he dressed in wool trousers and a flannel shirt, pulling on his boots with methodical care. The morning ritual was important. It kept a man grounded, kept him from drifting into the wilderness of his own thoughts. He'd seen what happened to men who lived alone too long. They forgot how to be human, forgot the small courtesies and structures that separated civilization from chaos. Jonas had chosen this solitary life deliberately. After Sarah's death, after the trial and the hanging of the men responsible, after resigning his position as sheriff of Mercy Falls, he'd retreated to this remote canyon. He'd built the cabin with his own hands, cutting and shaping each log, fitting them together with a care that bordered on reverence. The work had been his salvation, giving form to grief that might otherwise have consumed him. He stepped outside into the thin light of early autumn. The air was sharp and clean, carrying the scent of pine resin and distant snow. Red Bluff Canyon stretched out before him, a landscape of rugged beauty that never failed to stir something in his chest. Steep walls of rust-colored stone rose on either side, their faces catching the first rays of sunlight. Between them, a narrow valley followed a clear stream, its banks lined with aspen that had turned gold with the season. This was his world now. He knew every ridge and hollow, every game trail and water source. He trapped beaver and marten, hunted elk and deer, tanned hides and sold them twice a year in Mercy Falls. It was enough to keep him in coffee, flour, ammunition, and the occasional book. He needed little else. Jonas walked to the stream and knelt, splashing cold water on his face. The shock of it drove away the last remnants of sleep. He cupped his hands and drank, then stood and surveyed the canyon with the careful attention of a man who understood that survival depended on noticing what had changed. That's when he saw them, fresh. Tracks in the soft earth near the water's edge. Horse tracks, and many of them. Jonas crouched and studied the prints with growing concern. At least a dozen riders, maybe more, had passed through during the night. They'd come from the south and continued north, following the canyon's main trail. His jaw tightened. Travelers occasionally used the canyon as a shortcut through the mountains, but not in groups this large. And these tracks showed something else. The horses had been moving fast, pushed hard. Men running from something or men hunting something. Jonas straightened and looked north along the trail. The tracks were perhaps 6 hours old, left in the darkest part of the night. Whoever these riders were, they'd been in a hurry, and they hadn't stopped to make camp. That suggested purpose, and purpose in men traveling in large groups rarely meant anything good. He returned to the cabin and took his Winchester rifle from its place on the wall. He checked the action, confirmed it was loaded, and set it by the door. Then he poured himself coffee from the pot he kept warm on the stove and sat at the table thinking. The town of Mercy Falls lay 15 miles to the south. It was a small community, fewer than 200 souls, built around a played-out gold mine and sustained now by ranching and timber. Jonas visited 4 times a year to trade his furs and stock up on supplies. He knew most of the residents by name, though he kept his interactions brief and cordial. They respected his privacy, and he appreciated that about them. But respect and friendship were different things. Jonas had no illusions about where he stood with the townspeople. They remembered him as their former sheriff, the man who'd worn the badge with unwavering integrity. They remembered the trial, the way he'd testified with cold precision about finding Sarah's body, about tracking the men responsible, about the gunfight that had left 2 of them dead and 1 wounded enough to hang. They also remembered how he'd walked away afterward, disappearing into the mountains without explanation. Some understood, others thought he'd abandoned his duty. Jonas didn't particularly care which camp they fell into. He'd done what needed doing, and then he'd left. That was the end of it. He sipped his coffee and considered the tracks again. Large groups of riders didn't pass through Red Bluff Canyon by accident. The terrain was too difficult, the trail too narrow and treacherous. Anyone using it knew where they were going and why. Jonas had heard rumors over the past months during his visits to town. Talk of outlaw gangs operating in the territory, hitting stagecoaches and mining payrolls. One name kept coming up: Blackjack Cordell. The stories painted him as a man of unusual cunning and cruelty, leading a gang that numbered in the dozens, maybe more. They struck fast and vanished into the wilderness before posses could organize. If these tracks belonged to Cordell's gang, Jonas wanted no part of whatever business they were conducting. His days of law enforcement were behind him. He'd hung up his badge, and his sense of civic duty along with it. Let someone else chase outlaws through the mountains. But even as he thought it, Jonas knew he was lying to himself. Some habits ran too deep to break. The instinct to protect, to stand between the innocent and the lawless, that hadn't died with Sarah. It had only gone dormant, waiting. He finished his coffee and stood. The sensible thing would be to stay alert, keep to his trap lines, and avoid whoever had passed through. But Jonas found himself walking back outside, studying those tracks again, feeling the old familiar pull of duty he'd thought he'd left behind. The sun was fully up now, painting the canyon walls in shades of crimson and gold. It was going to be a beautiful day. Clear sky, light wind, perfect weather for checking his traps. He should get to work, follow his routine, let the world take care of itself. Instead, Jonas went back inside and began preparing. He cleaned his rifle thoroughly, loaded his saddlebags with extra ammunition, filled his canteen, and packed enough food for several days. He moved with the efficiency of long practice, his mind already working through possibilities and contingencies. By mid-morning, he'd saddled his horse, a sturdy gray gelding named Ash, and was following the tracks north through the canyon. He told himself he was just scouting, just making sure these riders weren't planning to circle back through his territory. But deep down, he knew better. Some men were meant for solitude and some for society. Jonas had thought he was the former, but maybe he'd been wrong. Maybe what he'd really needed these 15 years wasn't isolation, but time to heal enough that he could face the world again without seeing Sarah's face in every act of violence, every failure of justice. The tracks led him deeper into the canyon, toward a narrow pass that would eventually open onto the high country beyond. Jonas followed at a careful pace, reading the trail, noting where the riders had slowed or stopped. They were organized, disciplined. This wasn't a rabble of drifters. This was a coordinated group, moving with military precision. As the sun climbed toward noon, Jonas reached a point where the main group had split. Most continued north, but a smaller party, maybe 4 or 5 horses, had turned east toward the old mining claims. Jonas reined in Ash and sat for a moment, considering. The mines had been abandoned for years. The gold played out decades ago. Nothing there but crumbling shafts and the ghosts of failed dreams, unless someone had found a reason to go back. Jonas turned Ash east and followed the smaller trail. The sun was warm on his shoulders now, and the aspens whispered in the breeze. Somewhere above, a hawk cried out, circling on thermals. It was the kind of day that made a man grateful to be alive, to be part of this vast and indifferent landscape. But Jonas's hand never strayed far from his rifle, and his eyes never stopped scanning the terrain ahead, because he'd learned long ago that beauty and danger often walked hand in hand in these mountains, and a man who forgot that didn't live long enough to see many more sunrises. The tracks led him to the old Bandit claim, where the smaller party had stopped. Jonas dismounted and examined the ground carefully. They'd been here for at least an hour, and one man had done a lot of digging. Fresh earth had been turned, and there were signs of something heavy being lifted, furrows in the dirt where a burden had been dragged. Jonas found what he was looking for near a collapsed mine entrance, a scrap of burlap, and clinging to it a few flakes of gold, so that was it. Someone had cached gold here, and these men had come to retrieve it. Jonas straightened and looked north, where the main group had continued. This changed things. If Blackjack Cordell's gang was operating in his canyon, if they were using it to hide stolen gold, then Jonas's peaceful isolation was already over. He stood there for a long moment, the silver pocket watch heavy in his vest, the weight of decision pressing down on him. He could ride back to his cabin, gather his essential belongings, and disappear deeper into the wilderness. He could avoid whatever storm was coming, or he could ride to Mercy Falls and warn them. He could step back into the world he'd left behind. Jonas looked up at the mountains, at the clean lines of stone and sky, and made his choice. He mounted Ash and turned south toward town, toward trouble, toward the kind of reckoning he'd thought he'd never face again. Behind him, the wind erased his tracks, and the canyon kept its secrets, waiting to see what morning would bring. Jonas reached Mercy Falls as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. The town looked smaller than he remembered, more weathered. Main Street stretched 2 blocks, lined with false-fronted buildings that leaned slightly, as if tired from holding themselves upright for too many years. The general store, the saloon, the livery, the church, all the usual fixtures of a frontier town clinging to survival. He tied Ash to the rail outside the marshal's office and stepped onto the wooden boardwalk. Through the window he could see Marshal Pete Hendricks hunched over his desk, gray hair catching the lamplight. Pete was 63 now, too old for the badge, but too stubborn to give it up. They'd served together once, back when Jonas wore the star. Jonas pushed open the door. Pete looked up, and his weathered face broke into a smile that held equal parts warmth and wariness. "Jonas Brennan. Been near 6 months since I seen you?" "Pete." Jonas nodded and removed his hat. "We need to talk." The marshal's smile faded. He gestured to a chair, and Jonas sat, feeling the weight of civilization settle on his shoulders like an ill-fitting coat. He explained what he'd found, the tracks, the numbers, the gold cache at the old Bandit claim. Pete listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker with each detail. When Jonas finished, the marshal stood and walked to his window, staring out at the quiet street. "Blackjack Cordell," Pete said finally. "I've been hearing about him for near 2 years now. Started small, stagecoach robberies, cattle rustling. But he's grown ambitious. 3 months back, his gang hit a mining company payroll outside of Helena. Killed 4 guards, made off with 20,000 in gold. Territory marshal figures Cordell's got somewhere between 50 and 100 men riding with him now. I counted tracks for at least 24 horses in that smaller group," Jonas said. "If that's just a fraction of his gang, your estimate might be low." Pete turned back to face him. "What are you thinking, Jonas?" "I'm thinking if Cordell's using Red Bluff Canyon to hide stolen gold, he'll be back for it. And if he finds out someone knows about it, he'll eliminate that someone. You want protection. Jonas almost laughed. From you and what army, Pete? No, I came to warn the town. If Cordell's operating this close, you need to be ready. Get word to the territorial authorities. Request federal marshals. That'll take weeks if they come at all. Pete sat back down heavily. We're on our own out here, Jonas. Always have been. They were silent for a moment, both men understanding the grim mathematics of frontier justice. Then Pete spoke again, his voice careful. You could stay. Help me organize the town's defense. These folks would listen to you. I'm not a lawman anymore, Pete. Maybe not. But you're still Jonas Brennan. That means something. Jonas stood, feeling the conversation pulling him toward commitments he wasn't ready to make. I've done what I came to do. What happens next is up to you and the town council. He left before Pete could argue further, stepping back into the fading daylight. The street was nearly empty now, just a few townspeople heading home for supper. Jonas walked Ash to the livery, arranged boarding for the night, and headed toward the hotel. He didn't make it that far. The sound of horses came from the north, many horses moving at a gallop. Jonas turned and saw them cresting the low rise beyond town. Riders, at least 30 of them, spread out in a loose formation that spoke of military training or long practice at intimidation. They rode hard, kicking up dust that caught the sunset light and turned it blood red. Jonas's hand dropped to his rifle, still in its scabbard on Ash's saddle back at the livery. He was standing in the open street, unarmed, except for the pistol on his hip. People emerged from buildings, drawn by the thunder of hooves. Pete Hendricks stepped out of his office, his hand hovering near his sidearm. The riders swept into town like a flood, surrounding the main street, cutting off escape routes with practiced efficiency. They were hard men, Jonas saw, faces weathered by sun and violence. Most wore trail dust, and the casual arrogance of those who'd learned that fear was a more reliable currency than gold. At the center of the formation rode their leader, and Jonas knew him immediately. Blackjack Cordell sat his horse like a man born to command. He was in his early 60s, lean and straight-backed, with silver hair worn long beneath a black hat. His face was handsome in a hard-edged way, carved by years of riding and killing into something both compelling and cruel. He wore a long black coat despite the warmth, and twin pistols rode his hips in oiled leather holsters. But it was his eyes that held Jonas's attention. They were pale blue, almost colorless, and they moved over the town with the detached interest of a man assessing property he intended to claim or destroy. Evening. "Marshal," Blackjack called out, his voice carrying easily across the suddenly silent street. "Fine town you have here. Peaceful. I appreciate that in a town." Pete stepped to the edge of the boardwalk, trying to project authority his age and circumstances had stolen. "State your business, stranger." Blackjack smiled, and it was like watching a wolf bare its teeth. "Business, yes. We're looking for something that belongs to us. A cache of gold buried in the canyon north of here. I don't suppose you know anything about that?" "Can't say I do." "Shame." Blackjack's eyes swept the street again, and this time they found Jonas. Something flickered in that pale gaze. Recognition, perhaps, or calculation. "You there? The quiet one? You look like a man who spends time in those mountains." Jonas said nothing, but he held Blackjack's stare without flinching. "My name's Cordell," the outlaw continued. "Perhaps you've heard of me. I'm looking for a man who might have stumbled across something that doesn't belong to him. Someone who's been sniffing around the old mining claims. You wouldn't know anything about that either, would you?" Before Jonas could answer, Pete spoke up. "Nobody here knows nothing about your gold, Cordell. And this town doesn't tolerate outlaws making threats. I suggest you move along." Blackjack laughed, a sound without humor. "Brave words, old man. But I didn't come here to threaten anyone. I came to make a simple inquiry." He paused, letting his gaze travel over the gathered townspeople. "However, if someone has taken what's mine, I will find them. And when I do, there will be consequences. Not just for the thief, but for anyone who helped hide him." One of the riders at Blackjack's side leaned in and whispered something. Jonas noticed this rider was different from the others, younger, slighter, wearing a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. There was something almost delicate about the way this person sat a horse, despite the gun belt and trail clothes. Blackjack nodded at whatever was said, then raised his voice again. "We'll be making camp 5 miles north of here. If anyone remembers seeing anything useful, they can ride out and share that information. I'm a generous man to those who help me, and I'm a very different kind of man to those who don't." He wheeled his horse and raised one hand. The gang turned as one and rode back the way they'd come, disappearing into the gathering darkness as quickly as they'd arrived. But Jonas noticed that several riders remained behind, watching from the shadows at the edge of town. Sentries making sure no one left to raise an alarm or flee. Pete walked over to Jonas, his face drawn with worry. "Well, hell, I didn't expect them to come straight to town." "He knows someone found his cash," Jonas said quietly. "And he's putting pressure on the whole town to flush out whoever it was. What do we do?" Jonas looked north, toward where Cordell's gang had vanished. "You organize a town meeting. Get every able-bodied man armed and ready. Board up the general store and bank. Prepare for siege. And what are you going to do?" "What I should have done hours ago." Jonas started walking toward the livery. "I'm going back to my cabin. If Cordell's looking for the man who knows about his gold, that's me. Better he focuses on me than tears this town apart looking." "Jonas, wait." But Jonas was already moving, his mind shifting into the cold, tactical space he'd inhabited during his years as a lawman. Cordell had made a mistake by coming to town before securing his gold. That suggested impatience or pressure from whatever authority he'd stolen from. Either way, it gave Jonas options. He reached the livery and began saddling Ash, working quickly in the dim light. His hands moved with muscle memory while his mind raced ahead, planning routes, calculating numbers, assessing terrain. 15 years hadn't erased his training. It had just been sleeping. A sound made him turn. One of Cordell's riders stood in the livery doorway, backlit by the last red light of sunset. The slight figure from earlier, Jonas realized. As the rider stepped forward into the lantern light, the wide-brimmed hat tipped back, and Jonas saw a young woman's face. She was perhaps 26, with dark hair woven into 2 thick braids that hung over her shoulders. Her skin was sun-darkened, her features fine-boned but strong. But it was her eyes that caught him, brown and deep, filled with an intelligence and pain that seemed too heavy for someone so young. "You're the one," she said quietly. Her voice was low, measured, nothing like Jonas expected from someone riding with Cordell's gang. "You found the gold cache." Jonas's hand moved toward his pistol, but she shook her head. "I'm not here to fight you. I'm here to warn you." She glanced over her shoulder, checking the darkness outside. "My father, Blackjack, he's not going to let this go. He needs that gold to pay his men, to maintain control of the gang. Without it, he has nothing. Your father—" Jonas felt the pieces clicking into place. "You're Elena Cordell. Elena Cordell," she confirmed, with something that might have been bitterness or resignation. "Bandit's daughter. Scout and strategist for the most feared outlaw gang in the territory." She met his eyes directly. "And someone who's been looking for a way out since she was old enough to understand what her father really is." They stood there in the lamplight. 2 strangers connected by violence and blood and choices neither had fully made. Outside, the night deepened, and somewhere in the darkness, 200 outlaws prepared for war. "Why warn me?" Jonas asked finally. Elena's hand touched something at her wrist, a braided leather bracelet worn and faded. "Because I'm tired of watching innocent people die for my father's greed. Because I've been riding with killers since I was a child, and I don't know how to stop. Because when I saw you standing in that street, refusing to be afraid, I thought maybe there's still one person left in this world who remembers what honor looks like." She turned to go, then stopped. "He's bringing the whole gang. 200 men. They'll be here at dawn, and they'll tear this town apart until they find you. You can't win. You can't even survive. So ride. Ride as far and as fast as you can, and maybe you'll live to see another sunrise. And if I don't—" Elena looked back at him, and in her eyes Jonas saw something he recognized, the bone-deep weariness of someone who'd carried too much for too long. "Then I'll have watched one more good man die. And maybe that'll finally be the thing that breaks what's left of my soul. She disappeared into the night, leaving Jonas alone with his horse and his choices. He could ride as she suggested. He could vanish into the high country and let Cordell chase shadows. Or he could do what he'd done 15 years ago, stand his ground and face the consequences. Jonas finished saddling Ash and led the horse out into the cool night air. He didn't ride away from town. He rode north toward the canyon, toward his cabin, toward the place where 200 outlaws would come looking for him at dawn. Some choices he'd learned you made not because they were smart or safe, but because they were the only choices you could live with. And if you couldn't live with them, at least you could die knowing you'd tried to do right. The mountains rose black against the star-filled sky, and Jonas rode toward them alone, feeling more alive than he had in 15 years. Jonas reached his cabin 2 hours before midnight. He moved through the darkness with the confidence of a man who knew every stone and tree root along the trail. Ash picked his way carefully, trusting his rider's judgment as they climbed into Red Bluff Canyon. The cabin sat on a small rise above the stream, positioned with a clear view of the approaches from both north and south. Jonas had chosen the location deliberately years ago, with a lawman's eye for defensive positions. Now that foresight would be tested. He unsaddled Ash and turned the horse into the small corral behind the cabin. The gelding would need his strength in the days ahead, assuming there were days ahead. Jonas gave him grain and fresh water, then stood for a moment with his hand on the horse's neck, drawing comfort from the animal's solid warmth. Inside the cabin, Jonas lit a single lamp and began preparations. He pulled out his gun-cleaning kit and stripped his Winchester, examining each component with meticulous care. The rifle was old but reliable, a model 1873 that had served him well for decades. He cleaned and oiled it, then did the same with his pistol, a Colt single-action army that had been with him since his days wearing a badge. Ammunition, next. Jonas took inventory of what he had. 3 boxes of rifle cartridges, perhaps 120 rounds total. 2 boxes of pistol ammunition, not nearly enough if Elena's warning was accurate. 200 men. Even if only half of them were competent shots, Jonas would be overwhelmed by sheer numbers, but numbers weren't everything. Jonas had something they didn't: knowledge of terrain, prepared positions, and the cold clarity that came from having nothing left to lose. He worked through the night, moving with quiet efficiency. First, he fortified the cabin's windows, using heavy timber he'd stockpiled for winter repairs. He left narrow firing slits that would protect him while allowing clear lines of sight. The door he reinforced with interior bracing, turning it into a barrier that would take considerable effort to breach. Outside, as false dawn began to gray the eastern sky, Jonas set his traps. He was careful and methodical, using techniques he'd learned hunting both animals and men. Tripwires strung across likely approaches, positioned to catch legs or create noise warnings. A deadfall he'd used for bear, repositioned to cover the main trail. Nothing that would stop a determined assault, but enough to slow them, to make them cautious, to buy him precious seconds when the fighting started. As he worked, Jonas found his mind drifting to Elena Cordell. She haunted him. The contradiction of her, the daughter of a monster who'd somehow retained enough conscience to warn a stranger. He'd seen it in her eyes, that desperate hope that she could still be something other than what her blood and circumstances had made her. Jonas understood that desperation. He'd felt it himself after Sarah's death. The terrible weight of wondering if he could still be a good man after doing so many hard things in the name of justice. The answer, he'd learned, wasn't simple. You were what you chose to be, day by day, action by action. And sometimes choosing to be good meant choosing to fight when running would be easier. The sun rose slowly, painting the canyon walls in shades of amber and rose. Jonas stood on his porch, rifle in hand, and watched the light spread across the valley. It was beautiful, achingly so. He wondered if Sarah could see it wherever she was. He wondered if she'd understand why he'd chosen to stand here rather than run. His hand touched the pocket watch in his vest. Still there, still ticking, still counting down the seconds of his life with mechanical precision. A sound reached him from the south, horses moving up the canyon trail. Not the full gang yet, just an advance party. Perhaps a dozen riders, maybe less. Jonas moved inside and took his position at the front window, settling the rifle's stock against his shoulder. They came into view 5 minutes later. 8 riders, spread out in a cautious formation. They'd sent scouts ahead, Jonas noted with approval. These weren't amateurs. They moved with the coordination of men who'd fought together, who trusted each other's abilities. The riders stopped about 100 yards from the cabin. One of them called out, his voice carrying clearly in the morning stillness. "You in the cabin! Blackjack Cordell wants words with you. Come out peaceful and no one gets hurt." Jonas said nothing. He watched through his firing slit, counting weapons, assessing horses, looking for weaknesses. "We know you found the gold cache," the man continued. "We are not here to kill you. Just tell us where you moved it and we'll be on our way." Still, Jonas remained silent. The truth was, he hadn't moved the gold. It had been gone when he arrived at the Bennett claim. Cordell's men had already retrieved it. But they didn't know that he knew that. They thought he'd taken it, which meant they thought he knew where it was. That ignorance was the only leverage he had. "All right, Hardway it is," the rider said. He gestured to his men, and they began to spread out, circling the cabin at a distance. Jonas tracked their movements, choosing his moment. When one rider moved into clear range, separated slightly from the others, Jonas fired. The shot was clean, dropping the man from his saddle before the sound of the gunshot had even finished echoing off the canyon walls. Chaos erupted. The remaining riders scattered, seeking cover behind rocks and trees. Return fire hammered the cabin, bullets thudding into logs and whining off stone. Jonas moved to a different window, fired again, missed. The riders were in cover now, harder targets. A tense standoff developed. The attackers had Jonas pinned, but they couldn't advance without exposing themselves to his rifle. Jonas had protection, but he was outnumbered and surrounded. Time favored them, not him. Then Jonas heard it, the tripwire he'd set on the north approach, a sharp twang, followed by a man's curse. He shifted position and saw another rider limping away from the wire, his horse spooked and bolting. 3 men now, counting the one he'd killed. The fight continued for another hour, punctuated by bursts of gunfire and long stretches of tense silence. Jonas fought with cold precision, taking careful shots, making every bullet count. He wounded another rider, driving them back toward the main trail. Finally, a voice called out, different from the first, younger and edged with frustration. "Brennan! Jonas Brennan! We know who you are. Former sheriff. Lost your wife to the Dixon gang. You killed 2 of them yourself. Got the 3rd hanged. That took guts. Blackjack respects that." Jonas shifted to see who was speaking, a young man, maybe 30, with a scar across his jaw and eyes that held too much knowing for his years. "My name's Reese. I'm Blackjack's lieutenant. He sent me here to make you an offer. You tell us where the gold is. We let you ride out of here alive. You can have a horse, supplies, a head start. Hell, he'll even give you a percentage, $5,000, just for information. $5,000. Once, that would have been a fortune to Jonas. Now it meant nothing. Money couldn't buy back what he'd lost, or change what he'd become. "Or," Reese continued when Jonas didn't respond, "we can do this the hard way. Blackjack's got 200 men camped 5 miles from here. You've killed 2 of our boys and wounded 2 more. That'll get you killed real slow when the full gang arrives. Think about it, Brennan. Is dying for gold that isn't even yours really worth it?" Jonas considered his response carefully. When he spoke, his voice was steady and clear. "The gold's gone. Your boys already dug it up yesterday. Whatever you're looking for, it's not here." Silence greeted this statement. Then Reese spoke again. His tone changed. "You're lying. Search my cabin if you want. You won't find anything." More silence, then urgent whispered conversation among the attackers. Jonas waited, rifle ready, watching for any sign of movement. Finally, Reese called out again. "We're pulling back. But this isn't over, Brennan, not by a long shot. Blackjack will want to hear about this himself." The riders withdrew, collecting their dead and wounded. Jonas watched them go, knowing this had been just the opening skirmish. The real battle was yet to come. He spent the afternoon strengthening his defenses and rationing his ammunition. Every shot from here on would need to count. He also prepared fallback positions. If they breached the cabin, he'd retreat to the sleeping alcove, then if necessary, out the back window to the rocks behind the building. As evening approached, Jonas sat at his table and ate a cold meal of jerky and hardtack. His hands were steady, his mind clear. He'd done what he could to prepare. The rest was up to fate, luck, and whatever skills he still possessed after 15 years of rust. Through the window he could see the first stars emerging in the darkening sky. Sarah had loved the stars. She used to stand on this very porch, back before the cabin existed, back when it was just a dream they shared, and point out constellations. Jonas had never learned their proper names, but he'd learned which ones mattered to her, and that had been enough. The sound of a single horse approaching pulled him from his memories. Jonas moved to the window, rifle ready, but the rider came slowly, hands visible and empty. As the figure drew closer, Jonas recognized the slight build, the braided hair. Elena Cordell had returned. She stopped her horse 20 yards from the cabin and dismounted. In the fading light, Jonas could see she carried no weapons. Her gun belt hung from her saddle, deliberately left behind. "I'm alone," she called out, "and I'm here to talk, not fight." Jonas kept his rifle trained on her. "Your father send you?" "No. He doesn't know I'm here." She took a step closer. "The men you fought today, they told him what you said about the gold. He didn't believe it at first, but he sent riders back to the Bandit claim. They confirmed the cache is empty." So now he thinks you moved it, hid it somewhere in the canyon, and he's bringing the entire gang at dawn to tear this place apart until he finds it. Elena's voice was steady, but Jonas heard the tremor beneath it. 200 men, Jonas. You can't survive that. No one could. Then why are you here? She was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her words came slowly, as if each one cost her something. "Because I'm tired of watching good people die for my father's greed. Because I've been riding with killers since I was 6 years old, and I don't know how to stop. Because when I saw you standing in that street yesterday, refusing to be afraid, I thought maybe there's still one person left in this world who remembers what honor looks like." Her hand touched the braided leather bracelet at her wrist, a gesture that seemed unconscious, habitual. "My mother made this for me when I was 5. She died a year later. My father, he wasn't always what he is now. The outlaw life changed him, hardened him. By the time I was old enough to understand what we'd become, it was too late to leave. Where would I go? What would I do? All I know is riding and shooting and running." She met Jonas's eyes across the distance. "I don't expect you to trust me. I don't even trust myself most days. But I know what's coming at dawn, and I know you're going to die if you stay here. So I'm asking you, please, ride out. Tonight. While you still can." Jonas lowered his rifle slowly. He studied this young woman who'd grown up surrounded by violence, yet somehow retained enough conscience to risk her father's wrath to save a stranger. There was courage in that, a kind he recognized from his own battles with duty and desire. "And if I do run," he said quietly, "what happens to the people of Mercy Falls? Your father will take his anger out on them, looking for information. Innocent people will suffer." Eleanor flinched, because she knew he was right. "Then come with me. We'll ride to Mercy Falls together, warn them, help them evacuate. The town's not worth dying for. Every town's worth dying for if the alternative is letting outlaws decide who lives in fear." "That's very noble," Elena said, and now there was an edge to her voice. "But nobility doesn't stop bullets. Pride doesn't win against 200 guns. My father has fought territorial marshals, army cavalry, Pinkerton agents. He survived them all. What makes you think one aging mountain man can do what they couldn't? Maybe I can't." Jonas set his rifle against the wall and stepped out onto the porch, into the open. It was a gesture of trust, or perhaps of resignation. but I have to try. Because if I don't, I might as well have died 15 years ago with Sarah." Eleanor stared at him, and in the gathering darkness, Jonas saw tears catch the starlight on her cheeks. "Then you're a fool, probably. But I'm a fool who's still alive, still fighting. That's more than a lot of good men can say." They stood in silence, the mountain man and the bandit's daughter, separated by 20 yards of canyon floor and a lifetime of different choices. Finally, Elena turned back to her horse. "I won't betray you," she said without looking at him. "When my father comes at dawn, I'll tell him I scouted the cabin and saw nothing useful, but I can't help you against him. He's still my father. That still means something." "I understand." She mounted her horse, then paused. "What was she like?" "Your wife." The question caught Jonas off guard. "Sarah. She was kind. Saw the good in people even when they couldn't see it themselves. She believed everyone deserved a second chance." "Sounds like she was too good for this world." "She was too good for me, that's certain." Jonas felt the familiar ache in his chest, old grief rising like floodwater. "But she stayed anyway. Taught me that strength isn't just about surviving. It's about choosing to be gentle when being hard would be easier." Eleanor nodded slowly, as if understanding something she'd never been taught. Then she rode away into the darkness, leaving Jonas alone with his preparations and his memories. He watched until he could no longer hear her horse's hoofbeats, then went back inside. He had hours yet before dawn, and many things still to do. But for a moment, he let himself sit at his table, hands wrapped around a cup of cold coffee, and think about Sarah, about second chances, about a young woman with braids and fire in her eyes, who still believed that warning a stranger might matter. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and the canyon waited for morning. The arrival of the territorial marshals transformed the situation from a siege into something far more complex. Blackjack Cordell was many things, but he wasn't a fool. He knew that fighting 50 lawmen would cost him dearly, even with superior numbers. The gang had thrived by avoiding direct confrontation with organized authority, by striking fast and disappearing before resistance could form. Jonas watched through the window as the marshals halted just beyond rifle range, their leader, a tall man with a grey beard, surveying the scene. He could see Blackjack's men withdrawing from the cabin, taking up defensive positions in the rocks and trees. The gang was regrouping, calculating, deciding whether this fight was worth the cost. "They're not going to rush us now," Elena said from beside him. She'd moved to look out as well, her shoulder nearly touching his in the confined space. "My father's smart enough to know he can't win a pitched battle against trained marshals. Too many casualties, too much risk. So what does he do? He negotiates, buys time, looks for an advantage." She paused. "Or he runs, but Blackjack Cordell wasn't running. Instead, he rode forward alone, hands raised to show he carried no weapon, approaching the line of marshals. Jonas couldn't hear the conversation, but he could see the body language, the marshal leader gesturing sharply, Blackjack remaining calm, almost casual. They talked for perhaps 5 minutes, then Blackjack turned his horse and rode back to his men. What happened next surprised Jonas. The gang began to withdraw, not fleeing, but pulling back in good order, moving north deeper into the canyon. Within 20 minutes, they'd vanished into the landscape, as if they'd never been there at all. The marshal leader rode forward toward the cabin, accompanied by 4 of his men. Jonas and Elena emerged from their barricaded room, moving carefully through the shattered remains of the main cabin. Everything Jonas owned had been reduced to splinters and bullet-scarred wreckage. 15 years of careful, simple living destroyed in a single morning. He opened what remained of the front door as the marshals dismounted. The leader was indeed tall, perhaps 6'4", with a weathered face that spoke of decades spent outdoors. His badge read U.S. Marshal, and his eyes held the particular wariness of a man who'd seen considerable trouble. "Jonas Brennan?" the marshal asked. "That's right, Marshal Frank Dawson, Territorial Division. We got word 2 days ago that Blackjack Cordell was operating in this area. Rode hard to get here. His eyes moved past Jonas to Elena, and his expression hardened. "That's Elena Cordell, the bandit's daughter. She fought alongside me," Jonas said quickly. "Against her father's gang. She's the reason I'm still alive." Dawson's hand moved to his sidearm. "She's also wanted in connection with a dozen robberies across 3 territories. I'm afraid I'll need to place her under arrest." Elena stepped forward, hands raised. "I won't resist, Marshal. I know what I am and what I've done. But Jonas is telling you the truth. I turned against my father. That should count for something?" "It'll count at your trial," Dawson said, not unkindly. He gestured to one of his men, who moved forward with manacles. "For what it's worth, Miss Cordell, choosing to help Mr. Brennan shows character." Judge might take that into consideration. As the deputy secured the manacles around Elena's wrists, Jonas felt an unexpected surge of anger. This woman had risked everything. Her life, her father's wrath, her only family, to stand with him against overwhelming odds. And now she was being arrested like a common criminal, while the real monster had ridden away free. "What about Black Jack?" Jonas demanded. "You let him go." Dawson's jaw tightened. "I didn't let him do anything. He made an offer. He'd withdraw peacefully and spare my men a bloodbath if I gave him 2 hours head start. I took it. That's not justice." "No, it's not. But it's 50 men alive instead of 50 men dead or wounded." Dawson met Jonas's angry stare without flinching. "I've been chasing Cordell for 2 years. I'll keep chasing him until I bring him in or put him down. But I won't sacrifice good men in a fight I can win another day." Jonas wanted to argue, but he understood the math. Dawson had made the choice any good commander would make. Preserve his force, live to fight again. It was practical, even wise. But it felt wrong, letting Black Jack Cordell ride away while his daughter paid for his crimes. "Marshal," Elena spoke quietly, "before you take me in, there's something you should know. My father doesn't have the gold he was looking for. His gang is fracturing. He's promised payment he can't deliver, made commitments he can't keep. If you pursue him now, you'll find his men scattered and vulnerable. This might be your best chance to break his organization for good." Dawson studied her carefully. "Why tell me this?" "That's your father you're talking about." Elena's laugh was bitter. "My father stopped being a father 20 years ago. He's a killer and a tyrant who uses blood loyalty to justify his cruelty. If I can help end that, maybe it makes up for some of what I've been part of." The Marshal nodded slowly. "All right. We'll move fast, try to catch them before they disperse." He looked at Jonas. "You have somewhere you can stay? Your cabin's not exactly livable." Jonas surveyed the wreckage of his home. Walls riddled with bullet holes, windows shattered, door hanging by one hinge, most of his possessions destroyed. It would take weeks to repair, if it was even worth repairing. "I'll manage," he said. "Town of Mercy Falls would probably take you in," Dawson suggested. "They're grateful you drew Cordell's attention away from them. Marshal Hendricks sent word about what you did, how you stood alone against the gang. That kind of courage means something to frontier folk." Jonas said nothing. He was looking at Elena, at the manacles on her wrists, at the resignation in her eyes. She'd made her choice and accepted the consequences, but something about it struck him as profoundly unjust. She'd shown more courage in one day than most people managed in a lifetime, and her reward was arrest and imprisonment. "Can I have a moment?" Jonas asked Dawson. "To speak with Miss Cordell privately?" The Marshal hesitated, then nodded. 2 minutes. Don't try anything foolish." Jonas led Elena a short distance from the cabin, where they could speak without being overheard. The morning sun was fully up now, warm on their faces, making the violence of the past hours seem almost unreal. "I'm sorry," Jonas said. "This isn't how it should have ended." Elena shook her head. "This is exactly how it should end. I've been running from consequences my entire life. Maybe it's time I stopped." She looked down at her manacled wrists. "Besides, prison might be the safest place for me. My father won't forgive what I did. If I were free, he'd hunt me until he found me. I'll testify at your trial. Tell them what you did here, how you chose honor over blood. That's kind of you. But I'm not asking for mercy I haven't earned." She met his eyes, and Jonas saw the same haunted strength that had first caught his attention in the livery. I just want you to know what I did today, choosing to fight alongside you, that wasn't about strategy or survival. It was about finally doing something that felt right. Even if it costs me everything, I'll have that. One choice that was truly mine, Jonas understood. He'd felt the same way 15 years ago when he'd tracked down Sarah's killers. Knowing the violence would mark him forever, but doing it anyway because some things mattered more than staying clean. The bracelet, he said suddenly. Your mother's bracelet. You should keep it. Ask the marshal if you can. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. Thank you. For seeing me as something more than just Blackjack Cordell's daughter. For treating me like someone who could still choose to be decent. You didn't choose to be decent, Elena. You already were decent. You just finally had the courage to act on it. Dawson called out that time was up. Jonas walked Elena back to where the marshals waited. As they prepared to leave, Elena turned back one more time. Jonas, if you ever make it to Helena, if I'm still there, will you visit? I'd like to know how the story ends. Whether you plant those seeds, whether you find peace. I will, Jonas promised, though he had no idea if he'd keep it. The future felt too uncertain, too full of questions without answers. The marshals rode out, taking Eleanor with them. Jonas watched until they disappeared around the southern bend of the canyon, then turned to survey his destroyed cabin. Everything he'd built over 15 years of solitude lay in ruins. The careful order of his life had been shattered as thoroughly as his windows. But standing there among the wreckage, Jonas felt something unexpected, not despair, but possibility. The isolation he'd wrapped around himself like armor had been breached, and instead of catastrophe, he'd found connection. A young woman brave enough to defy her father. Townspeople who'd sent for help even knowing it might come too late. A reminder that the world still had people worth fighting for. He walked to where his bookshelf had collapsed, pulling volumes from the debris. Most were damaged but salvageable. Among them, he found a small tin box that had been knocked from the mantel. He opened it carefully. 2 weeks passed in deceptive calm. Jonas settled into his role as sheriff, walking the streets each morning, checking on businesses, getting to know the townspeople again. He organized a volunteer watch, trained deputies, and established protocols for defending Mercy Falls if Blackjack returned. The town responded with cautious optimism, beginning to believe that perhaps the worst had passed. Jonas knew better. He'd learned to read danger in the wilderness, in the way birds went silent, in the tracks that told stories of predators circling, and he felt that same warning now. Cordell was out there watching, waiting for the right moment. On a cold morning in late October, Jonas was reviewing supplies at the general store when a rider came in hard from the north. Young Tommy Brennan, no relation despite the shared name, was one of Jonas's deputies, assigned to scout the canyon approaches each morning. "Sheriff!" Tommy half fell from his horse, breathless. "There's someone coming." Single rider moving slow. I think it's Elena Cordell." Jonas was moving before Tommy finished speaking, mounting Ash and riding north with 3 deputies following. His mind raced with questions. Elena should have been in Helena awaiting trial. What was she doing here? Had she escaped? Been released? They met her a mile outside town. Elena sat her horse with visible exhaustion, her face gaunt and pale. She wore the same clothes from 2 weeks ago, now torn and dusty. But it was her eyes that struck Jonas. They held a terror he hadn't seen before, even during the siege. "Jonas," she said as he approached, her voice hoarse. "Thank God, I didn't know if I'd make it. What happened? How are you here?" "The marshals." She swayed in her saddle, and Jonas moved quickly to steady her. "They were transporting me to Helena. 3 days ago we were ambushed. My father's gang, what's left of them. They killed the marshals, all of them." Jonas felt cold dread settle in his chest. "Blackjack freed you?" "No." Elena's laugh was bitter. "He didn't free me. He took me, dragged me back to his camp and—" She stopped, closing her eyes. "He's not trying to rescue his daughter, Jonas. He's planning to use me as bait." One of the deputies brought water. Elena drank deeply before continuing. "He's completely mad now. The gang's down to maybe 70 men. Everyone else deserted or got killed. He's obsessed with you, with Mercy Falls, with proving he's still in control. And he knows the one thing that might draw you out is me. How did you escape? I didn't. He let me go. Eleanor's hands trembled on the reins. He told me to ride here to tell you he's coming. 3 days from now at dawn. He's bringing every man he has left, and he's going to burn Mercy Falls to the ground unless you surrender yourself to him. Jonas absorbed this, his tactical mind already working through implications. He wants me that badly? It's not about want anymore. It's about need. His identity as a leader, as a man people fear. It all fell apart when his own daughter chose you over him. He has to destroy you publicly to rebuild his reputation. And if he can terrorize a town in the process, if he can prove that defying Blackjack Cordell leads to death and ruin, then maybe he can hold what's left of his gang together. They rode back to Mercy Falls slowly, giving Elena time to rest. Once in town, Jonas brought her to the marshal's office where Pete Hendricks waited. Elena repeated her story, adding details that made the situation even grimmer. He's not planning a siege this time, she explained. He's planning a massacre. Ride in fast, kill anyone who resists, burn buildings, take whatever supplies and horses he can carry, then disappear into the territories before federal marshals can respond. Can we evacuate the town? Pete asked. Jonas shook his head. Not everyone. We've got elderly folk, families with small children, people too sick to travel. And even if we could move them all, where would they go? Blackjack would just hunt them down on the trail. So we fight, Pete said quietly. We fight, Jonas confirmed. But we need every advantage we can get. 3 days isn't much time. Over the next hours, they organized the town's defense. Jonas sent riders to nearby ranches and settlements, calling for any men willing to fight. He positioned lookouts on high ground, established firing positions, stockpiled ammunition, and medical supplies. The town's blacksmith worked overtime creating barricades. Women and children were moved to the church, the most defensible building, with armed guards posted. Through it all, Elena worked alongside them. Despite her exhaustion, she provided invaluable intelligence about Blackjack's tactics, his remaining lieutenants, the weapons and ammunition the gang possessed. She sketched maps of likely approach routes, identified key targets to defend, suggested traps and diversions. On the second evening, as Jonas and Elena were reviewing defensive positions in the marshal's office, she suddenly spoke. There's something else you should know. Something I didn't tell you before because... She stopped, struggling with the words. My father wasn't always an outlaw. 20 years ago he was a lawman, a deputy sheriff in Kansas. Jonas went very still. What? His real name is Jackson Cordell. He served under Sheriff William Brennan in Dodge City. Eleanor met his eyes. Your father, Jonas. The world seemed to tilt. Jonas gripped the edge of the desk, his mind racing back through memories he'd tried to bury. His father, William Brennan, had been sheriff of Dodge City until Jonas was 12. He died in a bank robbery, or so Jonas had been told. His mother had moved them to Montana afterward, never speaking much about what happened. That's not possible, Jonas said. My father was killed by outlaws. No, he was killed by Jackson Cordell. Elena's voice was gentle but unflinching. My father told me the story once, drunk and bitter. William Brennan caught him stealing from evidence, gold seized from a robbery. Your father confronted him and they fought. My father shot him, took the gold and ran. He's been running ever since, building a new identity as Blackjack Cordell, becoming the outlaw he was accused of being. Jonas sat down heavily. The revelation crashed through him like thunder, recontextualizing everything. His father's death, his mother's silence, his own choice to become a lawman. All of it suddenly had a different shape, a darker center. So when Blackjack learned who I was, Jonas said slowly, when he came to Red Bluff Canyon, he knew exactly who you were, Elena confirmed. He recognized your name immediately. That's part of why he's so obsessed with destroying you. You're the son of the man he murdered, the living reminder of the crime that started his outlaw life. Why didn't you tell me this before? Because I was afraid. Afraid you'd see me as just another part of his legacy, another person tainted by his crimes. Afraid you'd hate me for being his daughter. Eleanor's hands twisted the worn leather bracelet at her wrist. But you deserve to know the truth. You deserve to understand why he won't stop until one of you is dead." Jonas stood and walked to the window, staring out at the quiet street. People were preparing for battle, barricading windows, saying goodbyes to loved ones just in case. They were trusting him to protect them, to lead them through the coming violence. And now he learned that the man leading the attack had murdered his father, had stolen Jonas's childhood and shaped everything that came after. The rage he expected didn't come. Instead, Jonas felt a strange clarity, as if puzzle pieces he'd carried for 46 years had finally clicked into place. The nightmares he'd had as a child about his father's death, his mother's haunted expression whenever Lawman visited, his own drive to pursue justice with such fierce intensity, it all made sense now. "Elena," he said without turning around, "when this is over, however it ends, I want you to know something. You are not your father's crimes. You are what you choose to be, and you've chosen to stand against him. That matters more than blood." He heard her quiet intake of breath, the sound of tears being suppressed. Then her voice, steady despite emotion. "My uncle, the man you killed 15 years ago, his name was Marcus Cordell. He was my father's younger brother. He rode with Blackjack for years, participated in the raid that killed your wife. But before he died, he told you something about me, didn't he? About wanting me to have a different life?" Jonas turned to face her. "How did you know that?" "Because he told me the same thing, a week before that raid. He said I deserved better than the outlaw life, that he was going to help me escape. But he died before he could." Elena stood and walked toward Jonas. "Don't you see? This whole thing, you and me, my father's obsession, all of it, it goes back decades. Our families have been destroying each other across 2 generations. And now we have a choice to either continue that cycle or end it." Jonas understood what she was proposing. Not just defeating Blackjack, but breaking the pattern of violence and revenge that had consumed both their families. It was ambitious, maybe impossible, but it was also the only way forward that didn't lead to more graveyards and broken lives. 3 days, Jonas said. "We have 3 days to prepare for the fight of our lives against a madman who killed my father and tortured your childhood." "Those aren't good odds." "No," Elena agreed. "But we're not fighting for revenge anymore. We're fighting to end this cycle. That gives us something he doesn't have." "What's that?" "A reason to survive. He's fighting to die with his reputation intact. We're fighting to live and build something better." Elena held out her hand. "Partners?" Jonas took her hand, feeling the calluses earned through years of hard riding, the strength born from surviving impossible circumstances. Partners. They spent the night finalizing plans, positioning defenders, preparing for every contingency they could imagine. Word had spread about the coming attack, and more fighters arrived. Ranchers, miners, drifters who'd heard about Mercy Fall's stand and wanted to be part of it. By dawn of the 3rd day, they had 53 men and women ready to fight, armed with rifles, shotguns, and the grim determination of people defending their homes. Jonas walked the perimeter one final time as the sun rose. The town was quiet, tense, waiting. Smoke rose from breakfast fires. Children's voices carried from the church where families had sheltered. It was a good town, Jonas thought. A place worth fighting for, worth dying for if necessary. He found Elena at the northern barricade, checking ammunition stores. She looked up as he approached, and something passed between them, understanding, respect, and a bond forged in shared pain and shared purpose. "Whatever happens today," Jonas said, "I'm glad you rode through that gunfire to help me. I'm glad you chose to be better than your blood." Elena smiled, sad but genuine. "I'm glad you gave me the chance to choose. Most people never do." The sun climbed higher. The town held its breath, and in the distance, just barely visible on the northern horizon, dust rose from many horses riding hard toward Mercy Falls. Blackjack Cordell was coming, bringing 70 outlaws and 40 years of accumulated rage. But he wasn't coming to face a helpless town. He was coming to face a community that had decided fear was not an acceptable way to live. Jonas checked his rifle one final time, and took his position. Beside him, Elena did the same. Behind them, 53 defenders readied their weapons. And when the first shots rang out, when Blackjack Cordell led his final desperate charge, they would be ready. The cycle of violence that had consumed 2 families across 2 generations was about to end. One way or another, this was the last chapter, and Jonas Brennan intended to write an ending his father would have been proud of. The dust cloud grew larger, resolving into individual riders as Blackjack Cordell's gang approached Mercy Falls. Jonas watched through a spyglass from his position behind the main barricade, counting horses, assessing formation, looking for weaknesses he could exploit. 72 riders by his count. They came in a broad line, spread out to make themselves harder targets, but not so scattered that they couldn't support each other. Professional tactics, Jonas noted. Whatever else had fallen apart for Blackjack, military discipline remained. They're not charging straight in, Pete Hendricks observed from beside Jonas. That's smart. He's learned from Red Bluff Canyon. He's also testing us, Elena said from Jonas's other side. She'd refused to stay in the protected church, insisting on fighting at the front lines. Looking for weak points, gauging our numbers, seeing if we'll panic and make mistakes. The gang halted just beyond rifle range, forming up in clear view of the town. A deliberate display of force meant to intimidate. Blackjack rode forward alone, hands raised in a parley gesture. He stopped 50 yards out, close enough that his voice would carry but far enough to make a shot difficult. Jonas Brennan. Blackjack's voice rang clear in the morning air. I'm here for you, not these people. Come out and face me like a man and I'll spare the town. Refuse and I'll burn it to ashes. Jonas stood slowly, making himself visible above the barricade. For the first time, he got a clear look at the man who'd killed his father. Blackjack Cordell sat his horse with perfect posture despite his age, silver hair gleaming in the sunlight, face weathered but handsome. If you didn't know what he was, you might mistake him for a distinguished rancher or businessman. But Jonas knew. He saw it in the cold calculation of those pale blue eyes, in the casual way Blackjack held his rifle, in the slight smile that suggested he was enjoying this confrontation. This was a man who'd built his identity on violence and intimidation, who needed the fear of others to feel alive. Your quarrel is with me, Cordell, Jonas called back. But I'm not fool enough to walk into your guns. If you want me, come and take me. Blackjack's smile widened. Still playing the hero, I see. Just like your father, right before I put a bullet in his chest. Did my daughter tell you about that? About how William Brennan begged for his life at the end? Called out your name, actually. Said his boy Jonas was only 12, needed a father. Didn't stop me from pulling the trigger. Jonas felt rage surge, hot and immediate, but he forced it down. This was what Blackjack wanted. To provoke him into doing something reckless, to undermine his judgment with emotion. Jonas had spent 15 years learning to control such reactions. He wouldn't break now. My father was twice the man you'll ever be, Jonas said, his voice level despite the fury beneath it. He died with honor. You've lived without it for 40 years. I know which legacy I'd choose. Something flickered across Blackjack's face, anger maybe, or wounded pride. Honor doesn't stop bullets, boy. And in about 5 minutes, you're going to learn that lesson the hard way. He wheeled his horse and rode back to his gang. Jonas watched him go, then turned to his defenders. 53 people, men and women, young and old, looking to him for leadership. Some were experienced fighters, veterans of range wars or Indian conflicts. Others had never fired a gun in anger. But all of them had chosen to stand. Listen to me, Jonas said, his voice carrying across the defensive positions. What's coming is going to be hard. Some of us won't see sunset. But we're not fighting for revenge or pride. We're fighting for the right to live without fear, to build communities that outlast us, to prove that courage and conscience matter more than guns and cruelty. He paused, making eye contact with as many defenders as he could. Blackjack Cordell thinks he can terrify us into submission. But he's forgotten something important. People who have something worth protecting are more dangerous than people who only know how to destroy. So hold your positions, watch your fields of fire, and remember, we're not alone. We're together. And together, we're stronger than any outlaw gang. A ragged cheer went up from the defenders. It wasn't confident or particularly loud, but it was genuine. These people believed in what they were doing, believed enough to risk everything for it. Jonas moved along the defensive line, checking positions, offering encouragement, making small adjustments to firing angles. He divided the defenders into 3 groups: a main force at the northern barricade, where the attack would likely focus, a reserve group ready to reinforce weak points, and sharpshooters positioned in second-story windows for overwatch. Elena had organized the ammunition resupply system, ensuring runners could move cartridges to wherever they were needed most. She'd also set up triage stations and positioned the town's doctor where he could reach wounded defenders quickly. Every detail had been considered, every contingency planned for, but planning could only do so much. When the bullets started flying, chaos would take over, and the outcome would depend on courage, luck, and split-second decisions. The gang began their approach, not a wild charge, but a controlled advance, using cover where available, moving in coordinated groups. They'd learned from previous engagements, adapted their tactics. Blackjack might be mad with obsession, but he hadn't forgotten how to command. "Here they come," Pete shouted. "Hold your fire until they're in range." The distance closed. 400 yards. 300. The tension was almost unbearable, defenders gripping weapons with white-knuckled intensity, waiting for the order to shoot. At 200 yards, Jonas raised his hand. "First group, fire!" The volley crashed out, smoke blooming from barricades and windows. Several gang members went down, horses screaming and bolting. But the advance continued, the outlaws spreading out and returning fire with disciplined precision. "Second group, fire!" Jonas commanded. Another volley, another handful of casualties. But now the gang was close enough that their return fire was effective. Bullets hammered into barricades, shattered windows, whined off stone. One of Jonas's defenders cried out and fell back, clutching a wounded shoulder. The battle became a desperate exchange of gunfire, both sides pouring lead across the killing ground. Jonas moved constantly, directing fire, calling out targets, encouraging defenders who were starting to waver. Beside him, Elena fought with cool precision, dropping outlaws with careful shots, never wasting ammunition. The gang tried to flank the main barricade, sending riders around to attack from the east. But Jonas had anticipated this, and his reserve group met them with a devastating volley that drove them back. 2 more attempts to break through were similarly repulsed. An hour into the battle, the gang pulled back to regroup. Jonas quickly assessed casualties: 5 defenders wounded, 1 killed. Against that, he estimated they'd dropped at least 20 outlaws, maybe more. The math was working in their favor, but barely. "They'll try something different next time," Elena warned. "My father won't keep throwing men at a fortified position if it's not working." She was right. When the gang attacked again, they came with fire. Several outlaws rushed forward carrying torches and oil, trying to set the barricades ablaze. Jonas's sharpshooters dropped most of them, but one succeeded in igniting a section of the eastern defense. Flames leaped up, threatening to spread. "Pete, get that fire out!" Jonas shouted. "Elena, take command of the main line." He grabbed 3 men and rushed to the fire, using blankets and water to smother the flames before they could engulf the entire barricade. It took precious minutes, during which the gang pressed their attack hard. Jonas heard the increased gunfire, heard Elena's voice calling out commands, heard the cries of wounded and the thunder of hooves. By the time they'd extinguished the fire and Jonas returned to the main line, the situation had deteriorated. The gang had breached the eastern barricade, and hand-to-hand fighting had broken out. Jonas drew his pistol and rushed into the melee, firing at point-blank range, using the weapon as a club when outlaws got too close. The fighting was brutal and intimate, men grappling with knives, smashing each other with rifle butts, struggling for survival in the dust and smoke. Jonas fought with the cold precision of long training, but he also felt something else, a fierce, protective rage for these people who'd trusted him to lead them. Finally, the defenders managed to push the outlaws back through the breach. They quickly reinforced the damaged barricade with furniture and debris, sealing the gap before another assault could exploit it. Jonas looked around at his defenders. They were exhausted, wounded, running low on ammunition, but they were still fighting, still refusing to break. He felt pride surge through him. These were his people now, his community, and they were proving that courage wasn't about never being afraid. It was about standing despite fear, about choosing to protect what mattered even when the cost was high. Another lull in the fighting. Jonas used the time to redistribute ammunition, check on the wounded, and assess their situation. They'd held so far, but barely. The gang still outnumbered them, and Blackjack showed no sign of giving up. "How long can we hold?" Pete asked quietly. Jonas didn't answer immediately. He was watching the gang's position, seeing them regroup, seeing Blackjack riding among his men, clearly haranguing them to try harder. The outlaw leader was growing desperate, Jonas realized. His carefully cultivated reputation was crumbling with each failed assault. He'd promised his men an easy victory, and instead they were bleeding against determined defenders. Desperate men did desperate things. "He's going to try one more major push," Jonas said finally. "Everything he has left thrown at us all at once. If we survive that, he'll have to retreat or face total destruction. And if we don't survive it—" Jonas touched the badge on his vest, feeling its weight. "Then at least we'll go down fighting for something that mattered." Elena appeared at his side, her face smudged with powder smoke, her braids disheveled. "Jonas, look!" She pointed to the gang's position. Something was happening. Riders were leaving, peeling away from Blackjack's formation and heading south. Not fleeing in panic, but departing deliberately, choosing to abandon their leader. "They're deserting him," Elena said, wonder in her voice. "They've finally had enough." Jonas counted the departing riders. 20 at least, maybe more. That left Blackjack with perhaps 40 men, far fewer than he'd started with. The math had shifted decisively in the defenders' favor, but that made Blackjack more dangerous, not less. A cornered predator fought hardest, and now he had nothing left to lose. "Everyone ready," Jonas called out. "He's coming again, and this time he'll hold nothing back. This is it, the final push. Hold your positions and trust each other. We've come too far to break now." The defenders took their positions. Wounded men who could still fight dragged themselves back to the line. Elena checked her pistol, then looked at Jonas with an expression that held both fear and determination. "Whatever happens," she said quietly, "thank you for showing me there was still a choice. For believing I could be more than my father's daughter." "You showed yourself that," Jonas replied. "I just gave you room to prove it." In the distance, Blackjack rallied his remaining men. Even from here, Jonas could see the wild intensity in how he gestured, how he rode among them, whipping up their fury. This would be his last stand, his final attempt to salvage something from the ruins of his reputation. The gang formed up for their charge. 40 men against 53 defenders. But the defenders were tired, low on ammunition, and bleeding from dozens of wounds. The outcome was far from certain. Blackjack raised his rifle high, let out a war cry that echoed off the mountains, and spurred his horse toward Mercy Falls. His remaining men followed. Committing to this final, desperate assault, Jonas raised his own rifle, sighted down the barrel, and waited for them to close the distance. His hand was steady, his mind was clear, and when the moment came, he would do what he'd always done, stand between the innocent and the lawless, and trust that courage and community were stronger than cruelty and fear. The thunder of hooves grew louder, the distance closed, and the final chapter of Blackjack Cordill's violent life rushed toward its inevitable conclusion. The final charge came like a thunderstorm breaking over the mountains, sudden, overwhelming, absolute. 40 outlaws riding at full gallop, guns blazing. Blackjack Cordill leading them with the wild-eyed fury of a man who'd wagered everything on this single moment. Jonas held his fire until they were close enough that he could see individual faces, could read the mix of fear and determination in their eyes. Then he gave the command, "Fire!" The volley tore into the charging riders with devastating effect. Men tumbled from saddles. Horses went down screaming. But the charge didn't break. The survivors kept coming, driven by momentum and Blackjack's shouted commands. Closing the distance to the barricades with terrifying speed, Jonas fired again and again. working the rifle's lever with mechanical precision, his training from decades ago returning as naturally as breathing. Beside him, Elena did the same, her shots deliberate and accurate. All along the defensive line, Mercy Fall's defenders poured everything they had into stopping the charge. It should have been enough. By all tactical logic, the assault should have broken under such concentrated fire. But Blackjack's men were veterans, hardened by years of violence, and they'd decided to win or die trying. They reached the barricade still fighting, some vaulting over on horseback, others dismounting and attacking with pistols and knives. The battle dissolved into chaos. Jonas found himself in hand-to-hand combat with an outlaw who'd made it over the barricade, trading blows with rifle butts until Jonas managed to bring his pistol up and fire. The man fell, and Jonas immediately engaged another attacker, then another, fighting with the cold efficiency of someone who'd done this before and survived. Somewhere to his left, Pete Hendricks was down, clutching a wounded leg, but still firing his pistol from the ground. To his right, Elena struggled with an outlaw who'd grabbed her from behind. Jonas shot the man without hesitation, and Elena nodded thanks before returning to the fight. The noise was overwhelming, gunfire, screams, the crash of wood splintering, horses shrieking. Smoke filled the air so thickly that Jonas could barely see more than a few feet ahead. He moved through it like a ghost, appearing wherever the line seemed weakest, rallying defenders, shooting attackers, refusing to let any single point collapse. Then, through the smoke and chaos, Jonas saw him. Blackjack Cordell had dismounted and was fighting his way through the defenders with methodical precision, his twin pistols spitting fire. He was heading straight for Jonas, cutting a path through anyone who stood between them. This was it, Jonas realized. This was what Blackjack had come for, not to defeat the town, but to face the son of the man he'd murdered 40 years ago, to prove he could destroy this final reminder of his original crime. Jonas holstered his empty pistol and drew the one he'd kept in reserve. Blackjack saw him and grinned, a death's head smile that held no warmth or humanity. They stood 15 feet apart in a brief clearing in the smoke, defenders and outlaws still battling all around them. "Just you and me now, boy," Blackjack called out. "The way it should have been from the start." "You killed my father," Jonas said, his voice steady despite the rage burning in his chest. "Murdered him in cold blood and built your life on that crime. Your father was weak. He believed rules mattered more than survival. I showed him the truth right before he died." Blackjack's pistols came up. "Now I'm going to show you the same lesson." They fired simultaneously. Jonas felt a hammer blow to his left shoulder, the impact spinning him partway around. But his own shot had found its target. Blackjack staggered back, blood blooming across his chest. Both men stayed on their feet, both brought their weapons up again. "You're your father's son," Blackjack said, and there was something like respect in his voice. "I'll give you that. But being brave just means you die standing up instead of kneeling. Better than living on your knees to fear and violence." Jonas replied. They fired again. This time Jonas felt nothing. His shot had gone wide, thrown off by the wound to his shoulder. But Blackjack's second bullet punched into Jonas's side, driving him to one knee. His vision grayed at the edges, pain flooding through him in waves. Blackjack approached, reloading as he walked. "I'm going to kill you. Then I'm going to kill my daughter for betraying me. Then I'm going to burn this town until there's nothing left but ashes and memories. And people will remember that nobody defies Blackjack Cordell and lives." Jonas tried to raise his pistol, but his arm wouldn't cooperate. Blood soaked his shirt, warm and spreading. He was going to die here, he realized. After everything, Blackjack was going to win. Then Elena was there, stepping between Jonas and her father, her pistol aimed at Blackjack's chest. "It's over, Papa," she said, her voice breaking. "It's over. You've lost. The gang's destroyed. Your reputation's in ruins, and you're bleeding out from a gut wound. Just stop, please." Blackjack looked at his daughter, and for a moment something human flickered in his eyes. Pain, maybe, or regret. Then it was gone, replaced by cold determination. "Out of my way, girl. This doesn't concern you anymore. It's always concerned me. Everything you've done has been about me since Mama died. using me to justify your violence, to excuse your choices. But I'm not your excuse anymore. I'm my own person, and I'm telling you this ends now." Blackjack's laugh was wet and bubbling, blood on his lips. "You think you can stop me? You think you have it in you to kill your own father?" Elena's hands trembled on her pistol, tears streaming down her face. "I don't want to. God help me, I don't want to. But I will if you make me. Because Jonas was right. Some things matter more than blood." For a long moment, father and daughter faced each other across that smoke-filled battleground, the weight of 20 years of violence and pain hanging between them. Around them, the sounds of fighting were fading as the last outlaws were either killed or surrendered. This was the final confrontation, the last echo of a conflict that had consumed two families across 2 generations. Blackjack looked at Elena, really looked at her, perhaps seeing her clearly for the first time in years, seeing not the tool he'd shaped, the weapon he'd wielded, but the woman she'd become despite him. "You've got your mother's eyes," he said quietly. "Did I ever tell you that? You've got her eyes and her courage. She stood up to me too at the end, told me I'd become a monster. She was right." He lowered his pistols. "Do it," he said to Elena. "End this. Give us both peace." Elena's finger tightened on the trigger. Jonas, still on his knees and bleeding, watched her face. The agony of this choice, the terrible weight of having to kill the man who'd given her life, even as he'd made that life a misery. But she didn't fire. Elena lowered her pistol, tears coursing down her face. "No, I won't give you the easy death you're asking for. You don't get to escape the consequences of what you've done by dying heroically in battle. You're going to live, Papa. You're going to stand trial, face justice, and spend whatever time you have left thinking about all the people you've hurt." Blackjack's expression shifted. Surprise, perhaps even disappointment. "That's crueler than a bullet, girl. I know. But it's what you deserve." Elena's voice was steady now, despite the tears. "I'm done being your daughter. I'm done carrying your shame. You face your consequences alone." Blackjack swayed on his feet, the blood loss catching up with him. His pistols fell from nerveless fingers. "You really are her daughter? Your mother's daughter?" "Not mine at all. I'm my own person," Elena said. "That's something you never understood." Blackjack collapsed to his knees, then pitched forward onto his face. He lay still, breathing but unconscious. The great outlaw leader brought low not by heroic combat, but by exhaustion, blood loss, and the betrayal of his only child. Elena stood over him for a long moment, then turned away and moved to Jonas. She knelt beside him, her hands immediately applying pressure to his wounds. "How bad?" Jonas asked, his voice weak. "Bad enough. But you're not dying today, Jonas Brennan. I won't allow it." She called for the town doctor, her voice cutting through the settling dust and smoke. The battle was over. Around them, Mercy Falls defenders were securing the last few outlaws who'd survived. Jonas counted quickly. Perhaps a dozen prisoners, the rest dead or fled. Against that, the town had lost 8 defenders, with another 20 wounded, some seriously. A high price, but they'd won. They'd stood against overwhelming force and prevailed. The town doctor arrived, a weathered man named Samuel who'd seen his share of gunshot wounds. He examined Jonas quickly, his face grave. Shoulder wounds not too bad, bullet passed through clean. But the side wound is serious. He's losing blood fast. We need to get him somewhere I can work. They carried Jonas to the doctor's office, Eleanor refusing to leave his side. As Samuel worked to remove the bullet and stitch the wounds, Jonas drifted in and out of consciousness. He was aware of pain, of Elena's voice speaking softly to him, of hands working on his body with practiced skill. At some point, he became aware that he was lying on a proper bed, bandaged and relatively comfortable. The pain had diminished to a dull throb. Elena sat in a chair beside him, her face exhausted but relieved. "Welcome back," she said when she saw his eyes open. "You've been unconscious for 6 hours. Blackjack? Alive and in custody. Samuel patched him up enough that he'll make it to trial. He's in the jail cell now under guard." Elena touched Jonas's hand carefully, mindful of his injuries. "It's over, Jonas, really over. The town? Damaged but standing. People are already starting repairs. They're calling you a hero, saying you saved Mercy Falls." She smiled slightly. Pete Hendricks says when you're recovered, the town wants to throw a celebration. Build a monument or something equally embarrassing. Jonas tried to laugh and immediately regretted it as pain flared in his side. No monuments. I just did what needed doing. That's what heroes always say. Elena stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street where people were clearing debris and boarding up damaged buildings. I'm going to testify against him, you know. Against my father. Tell them everything, every crime, every murder, everything I witnessed over 20 years. Maybe it makes me a traitor. Maybe it makes me something worse. But it's the right thing to do. It takes courage to do the right thing when it costs you everything, Jonas said. You've shown more courage than most people ever manage. Elena turned back to him, and in her face, Jonas saw someone who'd been transformed by choice and consequence. She wasn't the haunted young woman who'd warned him in the livery 2 weeks ago. She was someone who'd faced the worst parts of herself and her history and decided to build something better from the ruins. What will you do? Jonas asked. After the trial? I don't know. Start over somewhere. Maybe out west, California or Oregon. Become someone new. She paused. What about you? Stay here, I think. Mercy Falls needs a sheriff, and I need a community. I've spent enough years hiding from the world. Time to be part of it again. Will you plant those seeds? The ones your wife saved? Jonas smiled despite the pain. Come spring I will. Maybe you'll come back to see them bloom. Spring came to Red Bluff Canyon with tentative beauty. Snow melted from the high peaks, streams ran full and cold, and the aspens began to show the first pale green of new leaves. Jonas stood on the porch of his rebuilt cabin, breathing in the clean mountain air, and felt something close to contentment. His wounds had healed, leaving scars that would mark him for the rest of his life, but no longer limiting his movement. He'd returned to his cabin 3 weeks ago, making the journey on Ash, with Elena riding beside him. Together, they'd completed the repairs, turning the bullet-scarred structure back into something that felt like home. But it wasn't the same solitary existence he'd lived before. Now Jonas divided his time between the canyon and Mercy Falls, serving as sheriff 3 days a week and spending the rest in the mountains. It was a balance that suited him. Enough community to feel connected, enough solitude to maintain perspective. Elena had found her own balance. She'd taken a room in Mercy Falls above the general store, working there and helping Pete Hendricks with administrative duties. The town had fully accepted her now, seeing past her father's crimes to recognize her courage and character. She'd become particularly close to several of the women who'd fought during the siege, forming friendships based on shared experience and mutual respect. Today, she'd ridden up to the cabin to help Jonas with a special project. They stood together now, near a small plot of turned earth beside Sarah's grave, marked by the hand-carved wooden cross Jonas had made 15 years ago. You're sure about this? Elena asked, holding the tin of Edelweiss seeds. Sarah would have wanted it, Jonas said. She always believed beauty could grow anywhere, even in the hardest places. And you've proven that's true. Elena carefully opened the tin and handed Jonas half the seeds. Together they knelt and began planting, working the small seeds into the rich soil, spacing them, as Sarah had once described to Jonas in dreams of their future garden. As they worked, Elena spoke quietly. I got a letter from Miguel yesterday. He's working on a ranch in California, learning honest trade. He says he thinks about us sometimes, about what we did in Mercy Falls. Says it gives him courage when the work is hard, and he's tempted to slide back into old ways. That's good. He's building something worth keeping. He asked about you, whether you'd planted the seeds yet. I think he wants to believe that good things can still grow from burned ground. Jonas pressed the last seed into the earth and covered it gently. They can, but it takes patience and care. You can't force growth or rush healing. You just have to tend what you've planted and trust in time. They stood and surveyed their work. The planted plot looked small and unremarkable now, just turned earth and possibility. But come summer, if the seeds took root, it would bloom with white flowers that caught the mountain light like captured stars. Elena walked to Sarah's grave and stood before the cross, Her head bowed. Jonas gave her space, understanding she was having her own conversation with the dead, maybe thanking Sarah for raising a man who'd given her a chance, maybe promising to honor the legacy of kindness Sarah had tried to live by. When Elena returned, she held out her wrist. The braided leather bracelet her mother had made was gone, replaced by a simple band woven from fresh leather. Elena had tanned herself. "I buried Mama's bracelet," she said, "next to where we planted the seeds. I thought maybe it would help them grow, give them something of love to draw from, instead of all the violence and pain." Jonas felt his throat tighten. "That's a good thought. A beautiful one. I learned it from you. You kept Sarah's memory alive, not through grief, but through action, through choosing to stand for what she believed in. I want to do the same for my mother. Remember her kindness instead of my father's cruelty." They spent the afternoon at the cabin, sharing a simple meal, talking about small things and large ones. Elena had started writing down her experiences, she told Jonas, not as confession or justification, but as a record for others who might be trapped in similar situations. A reminder that choice was always possible, even when it seemed impossible. "I'm thinking of going back to school," she added. "There's a teacher's college in Sacramento. I could study there, become qualified to actually teach children, instead of just dreaming about it." "That would suit you," Jonas said. "You have patience and wisdom beyond your years." "I have scars beyond my years," Elena corrected with a slight smile. "But maybe I can turn those scars into something useful. Show children that where you come from doesn't have to determine where you go." As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, they walked together to the edge of the canyon, looking out over the vast landscape. From here, they could see the trail that led to Mercy Falls, could imagine the town nestled in the valley beyond, could trace the mountains that stretched endlessly in all directions. "Do you think we'll see each other again?" Elena asked. "After I leave for California?" "I know we will," Jonas said with certainty. "You'll come back to see if the Edelweiss bloomed. And I'll need to visit Sacramento eventually. Check on my friend who's teaching children how to choose courage over fear." Elena leaned her head briefly against his shoulder, a gesture of trust and affection that felt entirely natural, despite everything they'd been through. "Thank you, Jonas, for seeing me when everyone else just saw my father's daughter, for giving me space to become who I needed to be. You gave yourself that space." I just held the door open. She straightened and smiled, and in that smile, Jonas saw the woman she'd become, strong, purposeful, unafraid of the hard work of building a life worth living. She was going to be all right, he knew. More than all right. She was going to thrive. That evening, after Elena had ridden back to Mercy Falls, Jonas sat on his porch and watched the stars emerge. He pulled out Sarah's pocket watch and opened it, studying the photograph inside, Sarah smiling, forever young, forever hopeful. He'd carried this watch as a weight, a reminder of what he'd lost. But tonight it felt different, lighter, not a burden but a gift. Evidence that love persisted, that good people existed, that choosing to care mattered even when caring brought pain. He closed the watch carefully and returned it to his vest pocket. Tomorrow he'd ride to Mercy Falls for his sheriff duties. Next week he'd help organize a barn raising for a family whose home had been damaged in the siege. Next month he'd testify at a territorial hearing about outlaw activity, helping build systems that might prevent future blackjack caudals from terrorizing frontier communities. And come summer, he'd watch white flowers bloom beside Sarah's grave, tended by a bandit's daughter who'd chosen conscience over blood. Watered by the memory of a woman who'd believed beauty could grow anywhere, the cycle of violence was broken. The revenge that had poisoned 2 families for 2 generations was ended. What remained was possibility, the chance to build something better from the ruins, to plant seeds of hope in burned ground, to prove that courage and conscience could triumph over cruelty and fear. Jonas looked up at the stars, at the constellations Sarah had tried to teach him, and felt her presence like a whisper on the wind, not haunting him anymore but guiding him, reminding him that life was for the living, that love persisted beyond death, That sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was simply choose to stand when standing mattered. He took a deep breath of the clean mountain air and smiled. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own choices. But tonight he was content. He'd stood when it mattered. He'd given others the chance to choose differently. He'd broken a cycle that might have continued for another generation, and in the spring, flowers would bloom where violence once stood, beautiful and defiant. Proof that hope was more dangerous than vengeance, because hope could actually win. The mountains stood eternal around him. The stars wheeled overhead. And Jonas Brennan, former hermit, former lawman, survivor of loss and violence and hard choices, sat peacefully in the gathering dark and waited for tomorrow.